Let's bring in Joseph Williams. He's a senior news editor with U.S. News and World Report. Joseph, I don't know much about your background. We've talked quite a few times, but I'm a father of a daughter, and I think about how important this day is for young women, and especially young women of color. And I suspect if you don't have a daughter, you certainly have a lot of friends that do. What does this day mean to you and to them?
Well, as a matter of fact, I do have a daughter. She's 21 years old, and she's sitting a little bit off to my right. She is excited about the victory. As a matter of fact, a few days ago, she was asking me why Nevada was taking so long and why this count was taking so long, and we reassured her that this is the way democracy works. But listen, there's no question that this is turning a definite page. President Trump really was very divisive, probably one of the most divisive presidents in recent memory, and a lot of that had to do with where he stood on racial issues and gender issues. Even coming into office, he had a lot of baggage with him, talking about the Central Park Five, about the numerous allegations of assault, sexual assault against the president. So clearly, if you are a female or a woman of color, this day is a very good one for you.
Let me ask you a question. There was a voter standing in line in Philadelphia who was interviewed waiting 3-4 hours to vote, and somebody asked him, why are you voting? And he said, Donald Trump feels like I'm the gum on his shoe, and we're here to show him he's the gum on our shoe. And to that point, black voters really carried Joe Biden in South Carolina, Jim Clyburn, that's been written about, his whole candidacy on life support, and undoubtedly on Election Day, black voters really turned out in big numbers. Talk to me about the difference they made in this election.
Well, clearly, you need look no further than Georgia. We're talking about a state that was bright red, that had not trended Democrat in some 20-odd years until President Bill Clinton swept through, a fellow Southerner who was right next door in Arkansas. He was the last president to get the Southern vote, and merely flipping it, not only flipping it, but having the possibility of having at least one and perhaps two Democratic senators from that great state is a real triumph for one Stacey Abrams. You'll recall that in 2018, she narrowly lost the governorship for Georgia, accused her opponent of kind of rigging the election because he was at the same time the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State is the one who controls how the elections go down, where people can vote, how often and how frequent the voting booths are. So she, on her concession speech, made a vow that she was going to mobilize and organize Georgia so that this sort of thing couldn't happen again. Now you see the fruits of that labor. Certainly black voters, a fair number of them, to be fair, split off for President Trump. His share of the black vote increased actually from around 10–11% in 2018 to somewhere south of 20%, which is significant and has more than a few Democrats stroking their chins and wondering what's going on here. But clearly the overwhelming majority of black voters stuck with Joe Biden. They knew where their interests lie, and more often than not, black voters are pragmatic. They understand that a dream candidate may not always deliver the goods. They understand that where progress happens, it happens more often than not very incrementally.
Let's talk about disenfranchised voters, because we saw a lot of that. You mentioned it about Stacey Abrams. We saw it in 2016. And yet, if there's, 2020 has been a horrible year. The pandemic's been terrible. But if you were to look for one bright spot, it would certainly be voter turnout and the ease of voting this time around. How do you see that translating? I mean, can the U.S. go back to the way it used to be? I kind of think that it really can't, that voting has to be easier now. People have seen how it's done. It can be easy. Do you think that's one of the pluses that's coming out of this election as well?
Well, voting should be easier. Many experts, many people who are of both sides of the political aisle believe in that strategy, but you have a certain core of the Republican Party and at least two Supreme Court justices who believe otherwise. They believe that voting is a privilege and not a right, and that you must show identification, you must pass all of these qualifications, you must be a state resident, you can't be a student, you have to have a certain form of ID, and you have to go to polling place X when polling place Y might have been closer, but polling place Y has been shut down. We've had laws that have restricted early voting. We've had laws that have eliminated polling places and how you can get an identification, most specifically in Alabama, Shelby v. Holder. That's a landmark case that is going to take a long time to recover from. So while there are impediments in place, one might say that Joe Biden's victory happened despite a lot of efforts to make voting more difficult. However, that being said, a 60%, 70% turnout in some areas, that is remarkable. It's on par, actually, with many European countries where voting is taken a lot more seriously in the United States. But I think the message finally is breaking through that people understand their vote matters. You see these very narrow elections where they come down to a few thousand and even a few hundred votes. So people are getting the message. That is a message that I think will resonate and will last for a fairly foreseeable future.
Well, Joseph, tell your daughter she's very smart. I was asking the same question, as were a lot of folks, but we got our answers today. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Indeed. Nice to be here.